Homer Adolph Plessy was born in New Orleans in 1862, a free man of color. Plessy was an eighth African American, so he could passe blanc, or he could pass for white, and throughout much of slavery, many free people of color were perfectly content to do this. But Homer Plessy came of age during a really turbulent time here in the South, during Reconstruction and the dark days that followed. After the failure of Reconstruction, when the federal troops left, then Southern Democrats kind of just came back in charge. Many of these ex-Confederates started to elect themselves back into their old positions of senators, congressmen, what have you. And in 1890, the Separate Car Act here in Louisiana successfully segregated our public transportation for the first time. Now, it might surprise you to learn this had actually never been done before. Historically, our public transportation was, in fact, integrated. Now, this law was incredibly unpopular here in the city, not just because many people saw it as morally wrong, but I think to your average Joe, it was just incredibly troublesome for life and business in the city. The city lost money. They had to buy more streetcars to accommodate the law. The train companies lost money for the exact same reason. And eventually, a group of concerned citizens got together and formed a committee. Aptly enough, they called themselves the Citizens Committee, and decided to engage in some activism to poke holes in this law. To that end, they enlisted Homer Plessy. Now, they had a scheme, which was to buy Homer Plessy a train ticket on an all-whites rail car bound for Covington, Louisiana. He got on, and the train company was in on it, so the conductor went up to him and said, "Hello, Mr. Plessy, are you a colored man?" And Homer Plessy said, "Yes." Basically said, "I'm black and I refuse to leave." Made a big scene. He was immediately arrested, actually by a private detective that the Citizens Committee had hired to, arrest him for just that purpose. So they really left nothing for chance. And he was arrested very close to the spot that I'm standing at right now. Case went before a local judge, John Ferguson, who ruled against Homer Plessy, but the Citizens Committee had anticipated this. They knew there was going to be some local resistance, so they fought it, all the way up to the federal Supreme Court. Now, on the federal Supreme Court in 1896, there were 8 justices. 7 of them were from the North. 1 of them was from the South. So you might think that they were cautiously optimistic. They thought, well, maybe these Yankees are going to vote for us, see it our way. Well, it was a 7-1 vote. All the Northerners voted against Homer Plessy, and they ruled to establish separate but equal as the law of the land. The only dissenting vote was the Southern judge, a guy from Kentucky named John Harlan. And his written statement about that day saying basically what we're doing today is wrong, future generations will regard it as such, and that the Constitution makes no mention of the color of your skin. That written statement would provide the basis for Brown versus the Board of Education, which in 1954 overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, ruled separate but equal unconstitutional, and began the long process of integration in the United States, though it would of course be many decades before anything even approaching integration would be possible. Poor Homer Plessy, though, he went to his grave in 1925 not only thinking that he had failed, but actually made things a lot worse. But history has vindicated him. I mean, he's a big hero here in the city, especially in the Tremaine neighborhood, which we commonly regard as the oldest African-American neighborhood in the country, because as early as the 1720s, there were free people of color owning property in that area of town. And Homer Plessy actually was married in St. Augustine's Church, which is a famous black Catholic church right over on Governor Nichols Street, right in the heart of the Tremaine. Now, you've probably already gathered from this story that our civil rights movement, such as it was, started significantly earlier than it did in the rest of the South. And this is purely because of the unique racial makeup that our city has almost always had. Now, even during the 1860s, we had sit-ins and protests and all the stuff you normally associate with Alabama and Mississippi in the 1960s. Even during the Civil War, and in fact, the biggest villain in the civil rights history of New Orleans was a Union general during our military occupation during the war, a guy by the name of Nathaniel Banks. Nathaniel Banks was commander of the Army of the Gulf, and when he arrived and took up his post here, he was horrified to see the level of integration that we had. He tried his very best to segregate our public transportation, and groups like the Citizens Committee just hijacked the streetcars and gave people free rides all day. But Banks was not to be deterred. He ripped the funding from the activist newspaper at the time, the Crusader, and it actually got so bad under his regime that a couple of influential free people of color went up to Washington to talk to President Lincoln about it and basically said, "Get your man in line." And there is a deep irony behind this whole sort of Nathaniel Banks debacle, because in his hometown of Waltham, Massachusetts, Nathaniel Banks is remembered as an abolitionist hero. It's true. There's a big statue of him out in the town common. He's going, And, it is true also that he was staunchly anti-slavery. He was an abolitionist through and through, a Union man, absolutely. But he also believed that black and white people living together took it a step too far.